Okay, guys. I'm going to dive in on unit number 6 in this lecture, which is a 4-lecture unit where we dive in on the cardiovascular system. So it's a brand new system to us. And we will also kind of throw in the middle the lymphatic system, which comes after this first lecture on the blood. This first lecture, which we'll get through in this video, shouldn't take us too long because it's pretty short. It's only 5 slides. It's really not any pictures to discuss too much other than I'll kind of put some stuff out. And it just is kind of an introduction into the cardiovascular system. It's not the first time we've talked about blood. Think back to the very beginning of the semester, we learned that blood was a form of connective tissue. We learned that there's kind of 2 major parts: the plasma, which is the fluid portion, and then the formed elements, which I'll get into all that stuff here on the next several slides. But let's go ahead and start reading through. All right, so cardiovascular system, 3 things make it up. The blood, obviously, but the blood that's found in our heart that we use to pump that blood, and then our blood vessels that transport that blood away from the heart to our organs, where they then can pick up the nutrients, remove the waste that they can or that they produce, and then that blood comes back to the heart for another round of exchange in our lungs, and so on and so forth. And that's something that's very important, and the whole goal of the cardiovascular system, because most of the cells in our body just are stationary. They can't go around picking up their own stuff. They can't use an analogy, drive to the grocery store. They can't take their trash to the dump. So there is the 3 components of the cardiovascular system that do that thing, or do those things for them. 2 major fluids besides blood. There's also interstitial fluid, which these 2 go very hand in hand. Blood is liquid connective tissue composed of liquid matrix called plasma, dissolving and suspending various cells and cell fragments. Interstitial fluid is fluid that bathes our body cells, so it's what surrounds the cells of our body, and it's formed when fluid diffuses from our blood into the areas surrounding our tissues. And that's kind of what I'm showing here with this little, I guess I could call it a flow chart, pun intended. Fluid that's in our blood, the water that's in our blood leaves the blood, enters the space between our cells, becomes interstitial fluid. And then that fluid can be taken up into cells, becoming intracellular fluid. And it's not going to just stay stationary. It will leave the cells, becoming interstitial fluid again, and then it will leave the interstitial space, becoming blood again. Just once again demonstrating the fact that our body is like a river where the fluids are always flowing, not like a stagnant pond or a lake or something like that. Overall, there are 3 major functions of blood: transportation, protection, and regulation. And I've listed off here several examples of each of those. First, transportation. A lot of things are transported by our blood: oxygen from our lungs to the body's tissues, carbon dioxide from those tissues to the lungs, nutrients from the digestive tract, metabolic wastes to the kidneys to be filtered out and made into urine, hormones, which we just got done talking about in our last unit, carried to target cells, and we can even transport stem cells from bone marrow to our tissues. Blood provides us with protective mechanisms in a variety of ways. It's involved in a non-specific defense mechanism called inflammation. Happens anytime we injure a body part or cells get damaged. Inflammation occurs. The cells called white blood cells in our blood provide us with immunity. There's 5 different types, and they all provide a specific type of immunity against specific things. We'll talk about that here after a bit. Some of our white blood cells produce antibodies, which neutralize toxins and pathogens, something that is very relevant to what we're dealing with right now. Hoping that doctors around the world can come up with a vaccine so that we can distribute that out, and we can all develop antibodies to protect us from this coronavirus. And then platelets are very important in initiating a blood clot, so keeping us from bleeding out. And blood regulates different things: fluid movement across capillaries to stabilize fluid distribution. Proteins in our blood act as a buffer and stabilize pH of our body. And we can actually regulate body temperature by transporting blood to our skin or visceral organs. So actually it's kind of like a transportation of heat, because heat kind of builds up in our body. We can move the blood, and thus the heat travels with it. So like when we get hot, we flush the blood to our skin, That's why our face, turns really red. The closer the skin or the blood comes to our skin, the more, sweat can cool it, and, a breeze can cool it. When we get really cold, we try to shut off that blood flow to our skin. That's why things look really pale, like your fingers can look really, really white. They're not getting as much blood flow, and that's why they're really painful and are at risk for things like, frostbite. Looking at the picture at the bottom, this is from this exact same picture in that tissues lecture, where we can see the different components of the blood. The stuff between the cells would be the plasma, and you can see the big white blood cells here shown kind of sporadically, but the majority of the cells that we see are these red disc-shaped red blood cells. There's also these little flecks. I call them flecks because they're actually not even complete cells, and those are the platelets of the body. All right, let's talk about kind of the general makeup of blood. It's a little denser, more viscous or thicker than water, has a slight sticky feel to it. Temperature is about 38 degrees Celsius or 100.4 degrees Fahrenheit. It's about a degree C higher than, if you were to put a thermometer in your tongue, or, go up the other end, taking in the rectum. Slightly alkaline pH, we usually like to see it around 7.4. 7.35, 7.45 is kind of the nice range that we like to see it in. 7.4 right smack in the middle of that. So it's alkaline, means it's a little bit of a base. If you're not familiar with pH scale, 7.0 is neutral. Anything above that is a base. Anything below 7 is an acid. So it's just really, really, really barely not neutral, just a weak base. Females, healthy young female is going to have 4 to 5 liters. If you think like a big pop bottle, that's a 2 liter. So about 2.5 of those. Men, we're going to have about 2.5 to 3 of those, because we have 5 to 6 liters. Overall, it represents about 8% of our total body mass. And as I've mentioned, 2 major components exist in our blood: the plasma and the formed elements. And let's talk about the plasma. This is the fluid portion of the blood and represents over half of our whole blood sample. So, if you prick your finger and blood starts spilling out, over half of what's coming out of you is the liquid portion. Okay, about 55%. Obviously, that's going to be very based on your hydration status, because about 91.5% of that is water. Okay, and obviously, water levels fluctuate on a daily basis, on an hourly basis, even based on, what we're exposed to in the environment, what we're doing. If we're sitting around, we're not sweating, we're, going to be able to maintain water levels. But if we're hot and sweaty, we're going to, have to drink water. And if we're not doing that, water levels drop. Yeah, but anyway, water is by far and away the most prominent portion. And the second most prominent would be the 3 plasma proteins: albumins, globulins, and fibrinogen, each of which has its own specific percentage and has its own specific role. Okay. Albumins are produced by our liver, function as transport proteins for several steroid hormones and for fatty acids. So they kind of act like an Uber, carrying different things like hormones in our blood to destination sites. Globulins are produced by the liver and by plasma cells, which plasma cells are developed by a type of white blood cell called a B lymphocyte. There's actually 3 different types of globulins: alphas, betas, and gammas. Alphas and betas are iron, lipid, and fat-soluble vitamin transporters, so they kind of act like the albumins as like an Uber. Gamma globulins are the ones that are best known as antibodies. And the fancy term for an antibody is an immunoglobulin, which, if you break down that word, globulin is at the end. Now you know why. And immuno for what it does, immune function. Okay. And then fibrinogen, about 7% of the plasma proteins produced by our liver as well, but play an essential role in blood clotting. Okay. There are other plasma proteins, about 1%, including enzymes, hormones, and clotting factors. And then there's just, a collection of other solutes, electrolytes, which, you think about like Gatorade, loaded with those. Sodium, potassium, calcium, magnesium, chlorine, bicarb, sulfate, hydrogen, phosphate, various nutrients like glucose and other carbohydrates, amino acids, lipids, cholesterol, and hopefully we don't have too much of these in our blood, because that can be very dangerous and not a heart healthy situation. Gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, but also even nitrogen, and then a lot of waste products, which are going to hopefully get to our kidneys to be filtered out. That includes urea, which we form when we break down proteins, creatinine, which occurs or is formed when we break down creatine phosphate in our muscles, uric acid, which is formed from the breakdown of nucleic acids, which nucleic acids are like DNA and RNA, and bilirubin, which is from the breakdown of hemoglobin. The other 45% of our blood or so, 45% is not a specific perfect number because this number is not perfect either, are the formed elements. And there's three major types. The most numerous are the red blood cells, or erythrocytes, as they are anatomically known as. You have leukocytes, or white blood cells, WBCs for short. There are 5 different types of those. And then there are the platelets, like I said, that are not a fully sized cell. They're actually fragments of a cell. Here's a picture zoomed in pretty amazingly 3,500 times with the naked eye can see to show those 3 formed elements. This is an illustration of what would happen if you take blood and put it in a test tube and run it through what's called a centrifuge, a machine that spins really fast. What it does is help separate different parts of that fluid based on density. The red blood cells, which are the most dense, would separate to the bottom. The plasma would filter out to the top, I guess I'd say. And then in the middle would be with a buffy coat where you find the white blood cells and your platelets. All right, let's talk more about those red blood cells. As I mentioned, anatomical term for those are erythrocytes. Most people call them red blood cells, or RBCs for short. About 98 to 99% of the formed elements in our blood. And they have 2 principal jobs, 2 principal functions: pick up oxygen from our lungs, transport it and deliver it to our tissues. And then the opposite of that is what we do with carbon dioxide: pick it up at those tissues, deliver it to our lungs so that we can exhale it out. Okay. Very tiny cells, but they're very cool looking and kind of a unique set of features. They have a disc shape to them, or discoid shape to them, approximately 8 microns in diameter and about, 2 microns thick. Okay. One of the most distinguishing features of them is their kind of indentation there at their center. To me, they always kind of look like a donut, except the hole's not been cut out. You can really see that indentation there. And the reason that they have that distinguishing shape, which you can actually see really nicely over here, which is real red blood cells inside of a capillary, because during their development, they actually eject the nucleus and most of the cell organelles. And so the cell just ends up kind of collapsing inward. And the whole function of that is to empty out the cell so that there's more space for what we call hemoglobin, which is what we use to carry the oxygen and to a lesser extent the carbon dioxide. Okay. There's also, aside from hemoglobin, 2 other proteins I want to talk about: spectrin and actin, which are found on the inner surface of the erythrocyte. Yeah, just a second, buddy. Can you go upstairs? All right, hang on a second. All right, sorry about that, guys. Okay, so we were talking about spectrin and actin. Anyway, these are on the inner surface of a red blood cell, and they allow for flexibility and durability, which is super important, which you can see right here. Allows them to kind of bend and flex and twist as they push through our capillaries. Capillary is the smallest type of blood vessel, and a lot of times it's just about the same width as a single red blood cell. And as you can see, they don't kind of go in an orderly single file as they push through a capillary. They push and twist on each other, which can be detrimental over time. It explains why red blood cells actually have a fairly short lifespan. They get broken apart fairly easily. It's not like they're completely breaking apart, but they just kind of break down. They don't have a nucleus, as I mentioned. They don't have those other organelles, so they can't really repair themselves as they kind of break down. So when they start to break down, they'll be removed from our plasma by macrophages in places like our spleen, which I'll talk about macrophages here on the next slide. Okay, I've already mentioned a little bit about hemoglobin. Makes up about 33% of the cytoplasm of a red blood cell. Overall, that totals to be about 200 to 300 million molecules of hemoglobin per cell. And this is the molecule, as I mentioned, that allows for the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Now, it's called hemoglobin, and that's because it's made up of two parts, heme and globin. Simple as that. Okay. The globin portion of the hemoglobin is what these blue squiggly lines are representing in the figure. There's actually 4 individual squiggly lines, 2 beta chains, 2 alpha chains, which if you kind of look hard enough, you can kind of see there's a little bit of a color differential. Not that that's important, but associated with each of those proteins is this thing that kind of looks like a flying saucer, which is a heme. Okay? So there's 4 chains, there's also 4 hemes. Okay? At the center of each of those hemes is a Fe2+, what we call a ferrous iron, which is where oxygen, a singular oxygen molecule, can bond to it. Okay? And thus, we have 1, 2, 3, 4 hemes. We can carry 4 oxygen molecules per hemoglobin. If you do the math, there's 200, 300 million of these guys. So you multiply that by 4, and then you have to take into account that there's an incredible number of red blood cells. Now, that's not total. That's just a microliter of blood, which is a very small amount. I've never actually looked it up, but I imagine the number of red blood cells is, way up into the trillions. So pretty amazing the amount of oxygen that we can carry in our body. Okay. Now, hemoglobin does also play a role, as I've mentioned, in carrying carbon dioxide, but its primary role is for carrying oxygen. It also actually helps regulate blood flow and blood pressure because it can release a hormone called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide causes vasodilation, and therefore will make blood vessels kind of balloon out, and therefore more blood flows through them, and therefore that enhances oxygen delivery. And then there's a 4th protein I want to talk about found in our red blood cells called carbonic anhydrase. It catalyzes or speeds up a reaction joining carbon dioxide and water together, forming what's called carbonic acid. Carbonic acid then dissociates into bicarbonate ions, which are essential for maintaining normal blood pH levels. All right, let's talk leukocytes, or white blood cells. Formed elements in our blood provide protection against infectious microorganisms, other pathogens. They're different than red blood cells, and that you can see in our pictures here. The nucleus is still present. There's lots and lots of lysosomes and other membrane-bound organelles, all those organelles that are going to play a role in what those cells do. Okay. White blood cells don't contain hemoglobin. Sorry, guys. They don't contain hemoglobin, so they have no role in carrying oxygen. Okay. There's 2 major types of white blood cells, what we call granulocytes and agranulocytes. Granulocytes have kind of a grainy appearance. Okay. That's what these 3 are. And then agranulocytes, remember, if you see the letter A in front of a word or at the beginning of a word, it means not, or the opposite. Okay. Agranulocytes just look a lot less, or really not even grainy at all. Okay. And so the kind of way that we classify white blood cells is just basically what they look like when you look at them under a microscope. Now, the 3 types of granulocytes all end the same way with the suffix "phil" or "phils" when you pluralize it. Okay. Neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils. Neutrophils are by far and away the most prominent type of white blood cell that we have, 67%. The cells have kind of a lobed nucleus, and sometimes there's as few as 3 and as many as 6, because I kind of give them a kind of funky shape to it. Their granules are small and poorly absorb both basic and acid stains, which is not super important. Something that I do definitely recommend is that they're the first leukocytes to arrive at an infection site, responding by what we call chemotaxis to chemicals released by damaged cells. So they are your first responders, if you think of them that way. They're also important phagocytes, which I always think of phagocytes like Pac-Man, cells that run around, not literally, but move around, and they basically can engulf or chew up and digest things that are detrimental to our body. They do things like destroy bacteria, several chemicals that they use to do so. After performing phagocytosis, where they engulf and kill the things like the bacteria, they're usually destroyed by antibiotic proteins and form what's called pus, which we all know what pus is, that kind of creamy, white, gross stuff that you can, pop out of a zit and stuff like that. Eosinophils, 2 to 4% of our white blood cells contain a bilobe, so there's 2 lobes, very distinguishing there. There's a little kind of strand of chromatin in the middle. Resemble mast cells, which are cells that are found only in connective tissue. Important thing about basophils, they contain, sorry, I'm on eosinophils. They combat the effects of histamine and allergic reactions. Phagocytized complexes formed by the action of antibodies on antigens, which are just foreign substances, and they destroy certain parasitic worms. Okay, now basophils. Your S-shaped nucleus, 2 to 5 lobes. Can't really see it in the picture. They resemble mast cells found in connective tissue, as I mentioned. And they contain histamine, serotonin, and heparin, released in response to tissue damage and pathogen invasion. Okay, notice the way that granulocytes ended, not the same for the way that agranulocytes end. The way that agranulocytes end is just with the suffix "cyte," which, remember, think back all the beginning of the semester, means cell. Okay. Lymphocytes, 20 to 25%, often are classified as small, medium, or large. Contain a circular nucleus surrounded by a small amount of blue staining cytoplasm. And essentially, you can see here in the picture, most of the cell is that nucleus. You can just barely see anything surrounding it. Okay. They're pretty cool in that they can return to our bloodstream. After leaving it, most of these white blood cells never return, which these guys can. And actually, some of these lymphocytes can last for years, which is not the same for most of the white blood cells. There's 2 major types that exist, T's and B's, as I usually call them. T lymphocytes, or T cells, which mature in the thymus. T for thymus is how I always tell students to remember. And then B lymphocytes, which I always tell students to remember, B for bone marrow. Okay. There's a 3rd type, natural killer cells. Really sound kind of cool, but they're not nearly as cool as their name indicates. But they do attack a wide variety of infectious microbes and certain spontaneously rising tumor cells. T cells attack any what we call aberrant cell, which just means abnormal cell. So things like tumor cells, organ transplant cells, cells infected by viruses. And B cells respond to circulating antigens like toxins, viruses, and bacteria. And they produce plasma cells, which are the cells that actually produce the antibodies. So you can say B cells produce antibodies. They don't directly do so, but they produce the cells, plasma cells, that do produce the antibodies. And then these final cells are called monocytes, have a large kidney-shaped nucleus surrounded by a large amount of blue-gray staining cytoplasm. These are the cells that enlarge once they've left the bloodstream and become macrophages, one of the other major types of Pac-Men in our body. Macrophages, I mentioned on the previous slide, are cells that can undergo phagocytosis, where they engulf microbes and cell debris. Okay, at the bottom of the page here, our last formed elements are platelets. This is a picture of, or illustration of, not an actual picture. Platelets are also known as thrombocytes, not actually cells, but small fragments of marrow cells called megakaryocytes. They are only going to make up about 1 to 2% of our formed elements in our blood. They're anucleated, so they have no nucleus. There's only a few organelles surrounded by a plasma membrane. What happens is a megakaryocyte grows really, really large, and then kind of just starts to break into little pieces, and the little pieces that break off are the platelets. They do have very important roles. They stop blood loss when we break a blood vessel, forming what's called a platelet plug. They also have granules that contain chemicals that, once released, promote blood clotting. But they do have a short lifespan, about a week, before they have to be removed by macrophages on our spleen and liver. Okay, last thing I want to do is just talk quickly about the formation of blood cells. As I mentioned, most of our blood cells have a fairly short lifespan, with the exception of lymphocytes, which can live for years. So whether it's hours, days, or weeks, they must be replaced continuously. We produce our blood cells, and this goes for all 3 types, even those platelets, which are truly not cells, but those cells that they form from are. The process in which they're formed is called hemopoiesis or hematopoiesis. Same thing, just two different ways to say it. Early in embryonic development occurs in what's called the yolk sac of an embryo. But once organs start to develop, the liver, the spleen, the thymus, and the various lymph nodes of a fetus take on that role. In the last 3 months of the last trimester before birth, the red bone marrow takes over, and that's where that is going to take place throughout the rest of our life. Okay. Our red bone marrow we talked about all the way back when we talked about bones, highly vascularized connective tissue. We find them in the microscopic spaces between the trabeculae of our spongy bone, which we find spongy bone in places like the bones of our exoskeleton, pectoral and pelvic girdles, proximal epiphyses of the humerus and femur. Red bone marrow contains cells called pluripotent stem cells or hemocytoblasts, which is what this cell is here, which then has the capacity to develop into many different types of cells, which you can see all these different boxes right here represent a different type of cell. Okay? These cells then reproduce, proliferate, and differentiate into many different types of cells. All those different blood cells that we've talked about, the macrophages that we form from monocytes, and can even form other cells, which include like reticular cells, which are found in our lymph nodes, mast cells, which I mentioned, are found in our connective tissue, adipocytes, which are found in places we know those as fat cells, and then even osteoblasts, which are in our bone, chondroblasts in our cartilage and our muscle cells. Which you can see here, we don't show any of those. We're just showing off the blood cells, red blood cells, the platelets from the megakaryocytes, all the different types of white blood cells. We do show plasma cells from the B lymphocytes, the macrophages from the monocytes, and I guess we do show one of those, the mast cells, but we don't show the others. Anyway, once those blood cells are produced in the marrow, they can enter the bloodstream through what we call sinusoids, which are capillaries that just have these really big holes or sinuses in them, where those cells can then begin to mature and function. Not an important figure to study or anything like that for the exam, but it is something I wanted to point out because it kind of shows you that pretty amazing step-by-step process where we go from one type of cell to just about any other type of cell. Not any other, but many others. Okay, that wraps up blood. So we will pick up and talk about the lymphatic system in our next lecture, which is really closely associated with the blood and includes cells that we just mentioned that are in our blood, because some of those migrate into our lymphatic system. All right,